Now on BBC News 24, it's time for Straight Talk, a look at the week's political events with our chief political correspondent, Guto Harri.
Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. We're told it's not inevitable and yet we're planning for war. The United States has now made a formal request for troops and equipment to attack Iraq. The details won't be spelt out to Parliament until Monday, but Tony Blair has already indicated he'll oblige. Can the armed forces cope? To what extent has the firefighters' dispute undermined them? And just how vibrant is the cabinet debate on top-up tuition fees? With me for some more Straight Talk this week, Joe Dillon of The Independent on Sunday, George Jones of The Daily Telegraph and Anne McElvoy of The Evening Standard. We'll hear from them in a moment, but first, Saddam Hussein must surely be aware at this stage how determined the US is to topple or neuter him. President Bush has asked 60 countries to help him draw up a contingency plan to attack Iraq. Britain was top of that list and seems certain to make a considerable contribution.
Tony Blair, arriving in Prague, has had the call. On Monday, George Bush passed the message, can he have a substantial British force in case of war with Saddam? Britain, first ally, first friend, seems certain to supply. As the NATO leaders gather tonight, the president is talking to 60 countries around the world who might help out. George Bush is talking up the possibility of war as he issued new warnings to Saddam Hussein. Own up to your arsenal of terror.
Should he again deny that this arsenal exists, he will have entered his final stage with a lie. And deception this time will not be tolerated. Delay and defiance will invite the severest of consequences.
The Foreign Secretary, also heading for Prague tonight, told me Britain isn't committing troops to war yet, but Jack Straw left little room for doubt. Forces will be deployed to the region soon.
This is a sensible precaution. It backs up the United Nations Security Council resolution with a credible threat of force, but no decisions have been taken by the United Kingdom in respect of any involvement in military action, and none will be taken unless Saddam Hussein becomes in material breach of this resolution.
As NATO leaders sit down to dinner tonight, some are suspicious of war with Iraq, some downright hostile. But it's very clear George Bush is counting on Britain to help lead a coalition of the willing. Troops will have to be sent soon just in case, war or no war.
And is war inevitable or not?
Well, I think it is pretty much inevitable. It's always just possible that Saddam Hussein could change his spots at this stage. But let's be realistic about this. This is a man who, for the best part of 10 years, has ignored the request to give up his chemical and biological arsenals. I find it highly unlikely that at this last stage he would oblige.
And George, is that what the United States has always wanted? Do you think has everything been designed to engineer this war?
I think the United States has always had serious doubts that the United Nations would be able to force Saddam to disarm, or that Saddam would actually come clean on his chemical weapons. They, I think, are prepared for war. They want war, but partly through Tony Blair's diplomacy and pressure, George Bush has agreed to go to the United Nations route. And the difficulty, I think, for the Americans and George Bush is, as it were, the preparations that they've got to make for war, the timing for war, is slipping. They've got to have a war as effectively between about January and March, because the only time you can really fight one in the Gulf, and there's not much time to get those troops there. So I'm not as concerned now as I was, say, a month or two ago, that we would see war in the new year.
Joe, does Tony Blair want war?
I don't think anybody wants war, least of all Tony Blair. I mean, it's a very, very high-risk strategy in terms of deploying British troops anywhere in the world, particularly in Iraq, given the very specific military difficulties that they would face out there.
How worried is he about his backbenchers? How worried will he be on Monday if a lot of them actually manage to vote for an amendment criticising him?
I think he's worried about his backbenchers. I mean, what I hear from behind the scenes is that Jack Straw has been telephoning individual backbenchers who are suspected to be against this amendment or against the motion on Monday. And he has actually been trying to quell the dissent to kind of make the troops sort of settle down ahead of that debate. I don't think the actual vote, if there is a vote in the end, will be a big vote against Tony Blair. But that said, it's the voices speaking out from his own backbenchers that are always bad publicity.
And Anne, the public are far from convinced that this war is really necessary, are they?
Yes, but the public on the whole has a healthy, dislike of going to war, and I don't think anyone would have any objection to that. But, all leaders have to lead when it comes to going to war. You have to make your case, you have to say why it's essential. Blair's been doing that for some time, if, through the UN route, Saddam could not be persuaded to disarm. But I think, Joe's point about the amendment is actually quite interesting, because what I'm sensing from, mooching around the Commons is you've got an awful lot of people who maybe some of them don't want war at any price. Some of them just don't like the thought of going to war without Parliament being consulted. And there's quite a broad coalition of 100 or so people from across the benches who would like to see Parliament consulted more about this. I think this is actually, in a way, a more difficult pressure for Mr Blair to handle than public opinion or the question, should you or shouldn't you, which is, after all, Prime Minister's job.
Is the timing slightly cynical here? He gets this debate, he gets it out of the way in the Commons before there's really a prospect of a major confrontation with Iraq.
Well, it's quite clever tactically because, of course, they will be debating a government motion which is in support of the United Nations route, which is, of course, what all his critics have been saying, go to the United Nations, don't go to war. So tactically, it's very clever. But we're not debating the real issue. I mean, the real crunch will come if and when you see the troop ships leaving Portsmouth with the tanks, British troops on board, they're deployed in the Gulf, there is actual war. And then, if that happens, I think there could be a big revolt on the Labour backbenches, particularly as, the mood on Labour side on a whole lot of issues is very fractious at the moment. So, in a way, this isn't the big debate on Monday. That's still some way off.
Joe, does that dissent go right up into Cabinet? Claire Shaw told us ages ago she had a bottom line. Would sending troops out there be that bottom line for her?
I'm not sure that she would actually come out were British troops actually in action and say, I don't agree with this. And I'm not sure that there's any member of the Cabinet that would do that. What they are saying is you must go through this United Nations route. And I think that that's to all of this. The worrying thing, I think, for some of the dissenters is that they won't go through this United Nations route, that the real agenda, particularly in the United States, is to actually wage this war in any case, regardless of what Saddam Hussein does, without recourse to the United Nations a second time. And I think that's where the worry is.
And it has to be seen as a real last resort.
I think it must be, yes, particularly for those cabinet ministers like Claire Short.
We'll leave that there for now. The prospect of a major military operation in the Middle East is daunting at the best of times, but the most senior military man this week made it sound even more worrying. One of the added problems over the last few weeks has been caused by the firefighters' dispute, tying up 19,000 men and women to cover for potential strikes. Addressing journalists on Wednesday, Admiral Sir Michael Boyce said he was extremely concerned about the situation and did not deny it had undermined the military's capabilities.
Today, a briefing by the Defence Secretary and the country's most senior military man blew open the secret. House fires at home are seriously distracting for armed forces meant to be thinking about Iraq.
Well, I'm extremely concerned for two reasons. First of all, I'm concerned on the, if you like, the military effectiveness of our armed forces, and secondly, I'm concerned of the impact on our individuals who are helping out in the firefighting situation. But clearly we can't perform at the full extent of our operational capability while 19,000 people are tied up standing by to do the firefighting duties.
Jeff Hoon, the Defence Secretary, was visibly flustered by the Admiral's blunt words.
Well, I didn't actually hear him say extreme concern, but...
Well, Minister, the rest of us did. And on the even tougher political question about whether troops training today on fire tenders might cross picket lines to take over more red fire engines, well, the Chief of the Defence Staff, a former submariner, torpedoed that one too. Easy ammunition for opposition leaders to use against the Prime Minister this afternoon.
And only last week, Mr. Speaker, Lord Falconer said that troops would cross the picket lines. Today it was completely denied by the Chief of the Defence Staff, who said they will not cross picket lines.
the Chief of the Defence Staff expressed his considerable concerns about, as he described it, the present, in this context, the present military effectiveness of British armed forces.
I don't believe it helps anybody in these circumstances if the opposition, rather than trying to help this situation, aggravate it, if they aggravate it by an opportunism that is as pathetic as it is transparent.
George Jones, I was there. It was your killer questions on this occasion that got Sir Michael to spill the beans. It was a wonderful moment, wasn't it?
It was. It's one of the first times in my journalistic career that I put a question and actually got an honest, straight answer. You could have knocked everybody over in that room, particularly as there was a total difference between a politician, Jeff Hoon, who was prepared to sort of say over something, try and use those phrases, Sir Michael Boyce, straight down the line and laying there right out in the open the military's concerns that they are being overstretched. This government is asking them to do too much on the foreign front while at the same time expecting them to fight fires at home.
And are those concerns justified? Are they slightly exaggerated? Military men do turn to sort of